Our scripture verse today is Matthew 6, 1 through 4. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of his word.
Good morning, all. I was looking for ideas on what to do for the message this week. And this particular passage really struck me. It caught my attention, which is what it's supposed to do. If you were noticing at the beginning of it, it begins with the words, well, depending on what translation you're in, it begins with take heed, or be careful, as my Bible puts it. But it's interesting, because there's not a lot of urgency attached to those words, but the original words did have a lot of urgency attached to them. Now, the context of this section is this is part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Earlier this year, we looked at some of the Beatitudes, and we heard that. That was the very beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and then it continues through several chapters. This is quite a long sermon he gives. And this is one of the sections of it. So you have to keep in mind that he's been up there speaking for a while. And he covers a lot of different topics. It's not like a sermon that you give on Sunday where you pick a single topic, a single message, and you develop on that point. No, he starts off with one topic and he talks about that for a while, and then he switches to a completely different topic and he teaches on that for a while. This is more like lessons. We're going to cover this lesson. All right, we've got that. Now we're going to move on to the next one. So he's been going through several lessons, and all of a sudden he says, be careful. Or actually, I like how the New Living Translation puts it, watch out, with an exclamation point. It wants to get your attention. You can almost imagine him kind of shouting it. He's just finished up another little topic, and he notices some people are kind of drifting off, maybe not paying attention, and suddenly he just yells out, watch out! And you can picture the situation. People are jumping, going, what? Huh? What's going on? That's what he wanted. He wants to catch your attention. It's easy to get lost. And so he wants you to know that it's there and that this is important. It's not actually something you run into in the Bible very often, this word, but it does happen every once in a while, and usually it comes on a section where it's something particularly important. So it's interesting that it happens here, because we don't often think of this topic as an important one, because it's talking about giving, and everyone hates to talk about giving. We don't like to talk about tithes. We don't like to ask for money. We don't like to do all that kind of stuff. And yet, Jesus put some attention here. He put some stress on it. He wanted you to pay attention to this because he knew it was important. Why is it important? You know, it's interesting. I love that at the beginning of verse 2, it says, so whenever you give to the poor. You notice there's not an option there. It's not so if you give to the poor, it's whenever you give to the poor. Means it's going to happen at some point. Jesus isn't giving you an out. He's not making it an option. He says, whenever you give. Now, that's a little bit harder these days to accept because we've kind of changed how we look at those things. But for the Israelites, there was a whole thing going on there. There are a lot of laws in the Old Testament about giving. One of them starts in Deuteronomy 14:22, and it says, "Each year you are to set aside a tenth of all the produce grown in your fields. You are to eat a tenth of your grain, new wine and oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock in the presence of Yahweh your God at the place where he chooses to have his name dwell, so that you will always learn to fear the Lord your God. But if the distance is too great for you to carry it, since the place where Yahweh your God chooses to put his name is too far away from you, and since the Lord your God has blessed you, then exchange it for money, take the money in your hand, and go to the place the Lord your God chooses. You may spend the money on anything you want, cattle, sheep, wine, beer, or anything you desire. You are to feast there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your family. Do not neglect the Levite within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you." Now this is an interesting tithe, because that's the word that they use here. The word a tenth is actually the word we get tithe from. They're the same words. Literally, tithe means a tenth. Now, this particular tithe that they're talking about in Deuteronomy is a celebratory tithe. You set aside a tenth of everything you grow, any income you have, and then at a certain set time, you go and celebrate. You have a big party, and you do it in God's presence. This is to remind the Israelites that God loves them, that they are with God, and that they are to celebrate in his presence. There are other tithes. See, this is one of the ones that's set aside in the law, but there are other ones. There was another tithe that was set aside for the poor and the Levites. You were supposed to give it to the temple, and that tithe to the temple would pay for the existence of the Levites. You see, the Levites were one of the tribes of Joseph, or one of the tribes of Israel. And yet, when it came time to set aside land for all of the different tribes, because each tribe got their own portion of land, the Levites weren't given a portion of land. That's because Moses set up the Levites as the priesthood. The Levites were the priests. They were to serve everywhere and to serve the nation of Israel. That meant they didn't have land. So there was a tithe set aside in the law that was supposed to be given to the temple so that it could pay for the Levites to exist, to feed, to live, and everything like that. And it was also used to feed the poor and the hungry and the foreigners among you. And then there's another tenth that says, at the end of every 3 years, bring a tenth of all your produce for that year and store it within your gates. And then the Levite who has no portion or inheritance among you, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow within your gates may come, eat, and be satisfied. And the Lord your God will bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. That's another tenth. Now that tenth is only every 3 years. But keep in mind, that's a lot of different set amounts. And then there's even more mandated giving that is described in the law. When you, if you were a farmer in your fields and you were harvesting, it specifically said in the law that the very outside crops, the crops at the very edge of your field, you were supposed to leave and not harvest, so that the poor and the foreigners and everyone and the widows and orphans could come along and pick that themselves. Another rule was that if you were harvesting and you missed something, you just missed a plant, you missed a tree, if you had an orchard or something, you forgot about it, When you realized you'd forgotten about it, the law said, don't go back and pick it. Leave that for the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners. There's a lot of these little different rules. So the Israelites understood this requirement of giving. Now, did they practice it all the time? No, of course not. But they understood that that was the rules. So when Jesus said, whenever you give, they knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about if, he was talking about the certain set times when you were supposed to be giving something. Now, in reality, even the old scriptures, you notice, don't talk about giving money. There's that one circumstance where it says if it's too far for you to haul it, trade it in for money, and then give the money. But it talks about giving of what you have. The farmers were supposed to take 1/10 of their crop and give that. So giving is not just about money. It's about what you have. If what you have, there's an interesting story. They talk about how when people get really, really, really rich, money becomes a less important thing. Now, a lot of them are still greedy. They still want more money. But to give someone money is one thing. That's a little thing. I'll give someone some money. What matters, what is harder for them to give up, because they have a very limited amount of it and can't get more, is their time. To set aside half an hour, whatever, to spend time with a person is a larger gift than to give that person money. This also works the other way around. Maybe you don't have money, but what you have is time. Then you can give that. God will take whatever it is. And then Jesus really gets down to the point. He talks about your attitude when you give. I love this bit here. It says, because it has a wonderful image in your mind. So whenever you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be applauded by people. You can picture, when I read that, I'm picturing in my mind some guy with a purse of coins in his hand, and he's actually got a trumpeter standing before him, playing some notes, drawing everyone's attention to him as he goes and puts the money in the offering plate, or on the streets he goes and gives it to a poor person. I love that mental image, but that's not necessarily what Jesus was actually referring to. See, I read up about this a little bit, and there's an interesting story. In the temples where you gave your money, it wasn't like we have with an offering plate. There was a chest in one specific place, where if you were going to give coins, you put your money in that chest. Now, the irony is, even in those days, they had problems with thieves. There were people who would steal the offering. Now, you have to wonder how desperate a person is, or how little conscience a person has to steal from the offering plate at church, but it happens. And so, even back then, it happened. So, this chest that was set up to receive the coins had a trumpet attached to it. And you would put the coins in the bell of the trumpet, and they would fall down the trumpet and go down through a narrower and narrower space and then land in the chest. And it was designed so that you couldn't reach your hand in the trumpet down and get down to the money and take the coins back out. It's kind of like if you've ever seen those at the mall, they have those little giving stations where you set up the coin and it goes around and around and around, and then it falls down a little hole at the bottom. It's kind of like that. You think that's a fun attraction to get people to give, and it is, but it's also a way of setting it up so that no one's going to be able to reach their hand in there and take those coins back out. And that's what this offering place in the temple was set up as. When Jesus talks here about sounding the trumpet in front of you, what he's talking about is very rich people would go up in the middle of service when everyone was there and loudly toss their coins at the trumpet so that they would hit and clang and make a lot of noise. And everyone knew how much coinage must be hitting that trumpet and going down into the offering chest. They were loudly making known, look at all this that I'm giving. Because everyone sitting there could hear clink, 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 clink as everything was hitting the trumpet. And then he talks about it in the street, and you can just imagine some rich person walking down the street, seeing a beggar, and ostentatiously pulling some coins out and dropping them from really high up so that you hear them hit the stones in front of the beggar. And everyone turns around as they hear the money hitting the ground and watch this rich man giving the coins to the beggar. This is what Jesus is warning about. He's warning about drawing attention as you give. And so he follows with the warning after that. I assure you, they've got their reward. You see, he's reminding you here, by doing this, by drawing attention to themselves, by giving just for the sake of looking like they're giving, for the praise they receive from others, for the attention they get, they are getting their reward. Their reward is that attention. Their reward is that praise they get from others. That's it. There is no further reward. In times, Jesus talks about what it will be like in heaven, and he talks about how those who have done well on earth will be proclaimed, and they will receive their riches there, and people will know there what they've done. He's saying here, you got your reward. You show up in heaven expecting everyone to cheer for you, saying, you were such a good giver, you gave so much money. No. You got your reward on earth. You got the attention on earth. You don't need anything else. You got it. Instead, he has a different direction for them. He says, but when you give to the poor, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. I was looking for some good examples of this, and I found a really interesting story. If you are a football fan at all, you'll know this name. Kurt Warner, who was a two-time NFL MVP quarterback for the Arizona Cardinals, started a family tradition he calls the restaurant game. The night before he headed out on a road game, Kurt and his wife would take their 7 children out to eat a family dinner. Once the Warner family is seated, one of the children would look around the dining area like a quarterback looking for potential receivers. When that child had picked a table, Kurt would call the waiter over and ask him to add that table's dinner tab to his own, anonymously. At a steakhouse before a September game against the New York Jets, a family of 4 received a free meal without knowing it came from an NFL star. The idea for the game came to Warner and his wife after Warner led the St. Louis Rams to a Super Bowl victory in 2000. It's a natural fit for them. They remember the days before Warner's NFL career, when Kurt was working a night shift at a grocery store, and they only had food stamps to feed their family. With that in mind, giving is a joyful family tradition for the Warners. We want our kids to grow up knowing that because of football, we are blessed, Warner said. We never want them to lose sight of what it's really about. Our circumstances are not the most important thing. It's what we do with those circumstances. Now, admittedly, he's telling about it now, so he's getting a little praise for it. But you can see the original intent here. When he sets this up, he tells the waiter, no, don't tell them, just anonymous. Someone else paid your ticket. And he's giving not because he wants to look good for it, but because he remembers what it's like to not have enough. He remembers what it's like to be struggling with your income, struggling to feed a family. And so he set up this game so that they could do it regularly and help others. That's what Jesus is talking about here. He doesn't want you to give for the pride of giving. He doesn't want you to give for the knowledge that others will recognize everything you've done and hail you as generous and amazing and so on and so forth. He wants you to give in secret for the right reasons. That's what matters. Because to give because you feel like you have to give because you feel like, because you want the attention, because you want someone to recognize you for it, that's not the right reason. You give because you know that this is God's heart for us to help others, to aid them, and to bring them closer to God. You give because you know people out there are hurting and in need, and that Jesus instructed us to be kind to them and to love them. It's all about the motivations. You see, while he says to give in secret, to not let the right hand know what the left hand is doing, the secrecy is part of it, but it's what motivates the secrecy. It's all about why you're doing this. It's all about making sure that your motivations are pure. Because when you give that way, then you will get your reward. Remember, it ends, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Elsewhere in the Gospels, it tells us to store up our treasures in heaven, not on earth, lest they rot. This is what they're talking about. These gifts that we give for the right motivations and the right reasons, these are treasures in heaven, things we will remember. People we may even meet there who come back to us and say, "Thank you for what you did for me. Because of you, I was able to feed my family. Because of you, I didn't get kicked out of my home." We don't know what all may happen, but then we will. And those are the treasures that are important. I can tell you, experience a little bit of it here on earth if you can, and you'll get a taste of what it is like later. So that's my reminder to you today. More important than the giving is to remember why we give, to remember who we're giving for. We're giving to worship God. We're giving to help others. We're giving to support His ministry. We're doing it because we know it's what God wants, and it's because we want to help others, to be a light in their lives. You know God's heart, and you know what's in your heart. Take this time, pray, talk to Him, and remember and listen to what He's saying to you. Remember, it doesn't have to be money. It doesn't have to be things that society even values. We give of our time. We can give of our attention. Maybe the way you give a tenth of what you have is to listen when God tells you, that person really needs to hear from you right now. They really need your voice in their ear. They really need your support. And we go over, and instead of spending the time on ourselves, spending the attention on ourselves, we go over, sit down, and talk with them. Maybe there's some service that you can perform, something that will help God's ministry. I can tell you we have an amazing group of volunteers here that help feed people lunch every weekday, that help in the pantry giving food to those who can't afford it. Maybe that's what you can give. I don't know. You do. Listen to God in your heart. Maybe it's even just giving some time working with other people in need. There are programs here, there are programs at the schools and other churches in the community where, and I can tell you, churches always need more leaders. People to step up and teach, people to step up and even just be there. I don't know your situation. I don't know what's going on in your heart. But if God is tugging on you to give something, please listen to him. We're going to have a final song. While we sing it, I ask you to listen to what he's saying to you, to remember the words he has for you and your motivations.